The authors of The Moment, Pulitzer Prize-winning associate editor of The Washington Post, Bob Woodward, and political reporter for The Washington Post, Robert Costa, join us now. Their new book, Peril, is out today, and it's good to have you both with us. I guess I would like, there's some pieces of the book that have come out, but what was most striking to you that perhaps hasn't been released yet to the public?
Wow. I guess the overall, that this was a national security crisis that Trump brought because countries like China, Russia, Iran looked at what was occurring in the United States. If you go back and look at what Trump said before the election, it was scary to people abroad. And then after the January 6th insurrection, it was frightening, and China particularly ignited on this. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, had these calls with the leader of the Chinese military and made it very clear, we're going to stabilize things, let's not have a war. And in a period of miscommunication and high tension, as history shows, that's when you have an incident or even a war.
So, Bob, I read the Milley part early on, like everybody did, and then read the entire book. I wasn't shocked by his actions. I guess maybe that's because like you especially, because you're in the middle of it, but I grew up reading about, in your books and other books, about how Henry Kissinger basically wouldn't let the Prime Minister of Great Britain talk to a drunk Richard Nixon during the 73 Arab-Israeli War, how for a year, from 73 to the time he got out in August 74, you had Nixon cabinet members doing everything they could to keep the world stable when Richard Nixon was not stable.
Well, that's exactly what happened here. And if you look at it, and Milley was confronted with a practical problem. They had very sensitive intelligence that the Chinese thought we were going to attack them. That is the most dangerous environment internationally. And so Milley talked to his counterpart in China, and we have the dialogue, and quite frankly, it's clear what he's trying to do. He's trying to tamp things down. I'm sorry to take this literally from the book, but you've got to do the literal moment when Milley says to General Lee, if we're going to attack, I'm going to call you ahead of time. People have misconstrued that to say, oh, that means I'm going to tip you off. What it means is there will be a buildup, there will be tensions, and they will be talking on this top secret back channel.
That's what he says.
Yeah.
That's what he says right there on page 129. If there's a war or some kind of kinetic action between the U.S. and China, there's going to be a buildup, just like there's always been in history. But, Joe, just hearing your point about 1974 and Schlesinger, Bob and I have talked about this. I mean, Bob and Carl Bernstein with the final days, President Nixon talking to pictures. We have some echoes of that moment in our book. On January 5th, the eve of the insurrection, the riot at the Capitol, we have this scene of President Trump not only pressuring Vice President Pence in the Oval Office, but then opening the door to have the cold air come into the Oval Office, talking to his aides, saying, can you hear my supporters outside, talking to these people as he hears them out in the streets on a cold, almost freezing night, hours before the rally that ultimately led to the riot. And that's the luxury of time, as Bob calls it, that we had to really dig into what actually happened. It was a domestic political crisis, a national security emergency as well.
Yeah, and what's so potent about that scene with Trump in the Oval Office, hearing the mob out there, and he's just enthralled with the mob, and we discussed this, and reminded me of Nixon talking to the pictures of former presidents on the wall at a moment as Watergate was cracking open and cracking his presidency. And the equivalent is that Trump isn't talking to George Washington or Abraham Lincoln like Nixon was. He's talking to this mob. This is his base. This is what he gets.
And who's he talking to that night? Steve Bannon on the phone. He's telling Steve Bannon over at the Willard Hotel, we need to kill the Biden presidency in the crib. That was the phrase based on our reporting in that conversation.
So,
and
go ahead, Mika.
tell us, Bob Costa, what you know about the pressure that was put on Mike Pence and on anyone else in the administration or members of the Senate to try and help Trump stay in the presidency even after he had lost.
Enormous pressure, Mika. And our book documents how Vice President Dan Quayle, as part of this coterie of friends and confidants who's talking to Vice President Pence as he navigates the decision, wants to probably run in 2024, wants to stay loyal to President Trump. But what's most interesting to us is the new information we discovered on how the legal side of the Trump team, John Eastman and other lawyers, were trying to convince the vice president and his team to decertify President-elect Biden's victory at the time in that transition period, offering all these legal arguments to have Vice President Pence essentially walk away from the lectern on January 6th. And that could have been a constitutional crisis.
Bob Woodward, it's Willie. Good morning. So let's talk about how close this country came, perhaps, to overturning this election. You have in vivid detail, you have Vice President Pence sitting in the Oval Office getting pressure from President Trump. You have phone calls from the Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy to President Trump around January 6th. What was the general posture of people like Kevin McCarthy, of people like Jim Jordan, people like Senator Lindsey Graham toward President Trump? Were they accommodating? Were they supportive of his big lie and what was going on January the 6th? What do we learn from some of those conversations?
What's fascinating is it's politics, and they're riding both horses. They're trying to find, and Pence is the model of this. Pence is really working hard to see if he can do something to stay on the good side of Trump at the same time as Bob was pointing out. I mean, it's Dan Quayle who calls him and reads him the Constitution and the law and says, you are not an actor in this. You simply mechanically count the votes, and Pence is under lots of pressure from Trump, and his lawyers in confidence are just saying you cannot do this. And in the end, Pence stood up and did the constitutional right thing. At the same time, when he's there and they're voting to certify, if he just said, oh, I'm confused, and walked off, we would have had worse than a constitutional crisis, because it would have undermined the legitimacy of the presidency.
But Bob Costa said, as you report in the book, Bob, it's, he was fishing around Vice President Pence for a reason to get this done for President Trump, calling former Vice President Dan Quayle, who shut him down pretty quickly. So as we look ahead to January 6th, to that day, and some of those phone calls, what were members of Congress, prominent members of Congress that we've talked about a lot on this show, what were they doing on that day? Were they encouraging President Trump to step forward and say, hey, stand down to the rioters who were attacking the Capitol? Or what were they saying to the president? Because there's been a lot of speculation about the content of some of those phone calls.
Well, you see House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy pleading with President Trump, unhappy with the situation. But what comes across in our reporting, Willie, is that a lot of efforts were being made at the time to somewhat corral President Trump. Members of Congress like Leader McConnell, though, were really not even talking to President Trump. But what you see is the lack of power among the Republican leadership in our reporting to do anything to constrain this president. And this reporting, this whole story of peril, a dangerous transition, really raises the question about the power of the presidency. Is there too much power in the presidency? Because, Willie, your question's the right one. What are leaders in Congress doing to keep the executive on the straight and narrow? but there's not much they seem to be able to do because this is a president who does not listen, President Trump, in those final days.
So there's, as you talk about the most dangerous transition in American history from Trump to Biden, there's a lot about President Biden in here, some annoyance that he displayed watching morning television. You can tell us about that. But also I want to hear Bob Costa about his friendship with Lindsey Graham and where that stands.
Well, it's quite. Lindsey Graham, Senator Graham of South Carolina, he was friendly with Vice President Biden when he was in the Obama administration, in the Senate, of course, from Delaware for decades. But that relationship was all but severed by the Hunter Biden scandal and Senator Graham's very aggressive approach to the Biden family. And Bob, you may have some thoughts on Senator Graham.
Well, you could write a whole book about Senator Graham's ambivalence. He's the one who says to Trump at one point, "You have effed up your presidency." And what Trump does, he hangs up on him. And then Trump calls him back later, and Graham says, "I would have hung up too." And so there's this view of Trump as somebody who's this force in the Republican Party, which indeed he still is. This is not going away. As the New York Times reviewer pointed out, the end of our book, which is the epilogue, really is a prologue to what's going to happen to the Republican Party, what's going to happen to the Democratic Party, who's going to be president, and will Trump resurface? I think we've, in our reporting and talked about it, pretty clear Trump is going to run, and some polls show he could beat Biden.